So I just want to say a word about what I'm doing here. I said a word about it yesterday. So I did the ESV expository commentary on Revelation, short pastoral type of commentary. If I live long enough, I have a contract to do the Baker exegetical commentary on Revelation. We'll see if I get to it. And what I'm doing here is I'm really not trying to plow new ground here. I just wanted to write a short, I'm about 50,000 words, semi-popular book on the theology of Revelation that I could just give to an ordinary person. So that's what I'm doing here. So yesterday I talked about the opponents mainly, the earth dwellers, the two beasts, Babylon and the dragon. Today I'm talking about God ruling on his throne in Revelation. Tomorrow I'm talking about Christ. And then, I'm not covering the whole book, but I just thought I'd throw it in. Honestly, I wasn't going to do this, but I threw a chapter in on the millennium. And I actually threw it in shamelessly. I did it, or shamefully. I did it because I thought it might help the book sell. So I thought I'd share it with you because, hey, you'll hear me if you're here Thursday. I'm very divided on the millennium, and I go back and forth, and so I'm always looking for help on that issue. Okay, so here we go. Today, God rules on his throne. The book of Revelation reveals both who God is and what he does. And probably the best place to start is that throne room vision in chapter 4, where God is worshipped as the creator of all. That open door in chapter 4 signifies that John is receiving divine revelation. We think of Acts chapter 10, verse 11, which is a nice parallel. John sees a throne in heaven, which signifies God's sovereign rule over all. The word throne is an important word in Revelation. It occurs 41 times. 37 of those times refer to the throne of God. That the word throne is especially clustered, not surprisingly, in chapters 4 and 5. That's the vision of God in Christ. So that's not surprising that we find it there. In those chapters, we see the word throne 15 times. Chapter 7, very important chapter, follows close behind with 7 times. And then, not surprisingly, we find the word throne 6 times in chapters 20 through 22. On 13 different occasions, the word throne is associated with the word seated. I think signifying God's settled and sovereign authority. In every instance, God's throne is not surprisingly, in heaven. And thus the heavenly vision communicates the truth that God reigns over all. And so here's the pragmatic point. The suffering faced by believers doesn't indicate that God has lost control over the universe. It appears to believers as if Satan and the beast rule over the world, but actually God rules over all. Very interesting, the word adathe in Greek, from didomi, the passive. It was given. So there's that passive from didomi, adathe. I don't know if all of you know Greek, but that occurs 21 times in Revelation. And in every instance, it refers to what God allows to take place on earth. Or it refers to what God gives sometimes in a more positive way, right? The white robe, chapter 6, verse 11, is given to believers by God. It was given. Or the pure and clean clothing for the saints in 19:8 is given by God. Or in Revelation chapter 20, verse 4, the judgment over the world granted to believers. In many instances, what is given refers to the judgments God inflicts on the world for the evil that is perpetrated. I'll say more about the judgments in this lecture. Most surprising, though, are the instances where God grants, as there's adathe again, permission for evil to be done. For instance, the Gentiles are allowed to trample the holy city, chapter 11, verse 2, which I think means persecute believers for 42 months. I don't have time to defend this, but I just indicated yesterday that I think I understand that 42 months to refer to the whole period from the resurrection to the new creation. So so that God is allowing, at least the way I read it, I recognize some of you may read it differently, but however you take it, God is allowing this to take place. God's role in the rule of the beast also stands out. The arrogant boasting of the beast and its rule for 42 months is also permitted, 13:5, given by God himself. Astonishingly, God even allows, it's given by God, he allows the beast to make war with the saints and to conquer them by putting them to death. So the beast's authority over the entire earth was granted by God himself. 13:7, in fact, chapter 13 has a lot of uses of the word adathe, of what God gives. In the same way, the second beast's ability to do signs and miracles, right, in chapter 13, verse 14, that's given by God as well. God permitted the second beast to grant breath to the image of the beast so that the image of the beast could both speak and cause whoever would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. The passive tense of the verb adathe was given removes God, so this is very important for me. The passive tense removes God directly from the evil that is perpetrated in the world. And thus John does not conceive of God as directly willing evil. On the other hand, evil doesn't exist apart from the divine will, as if it has an independent existence. Evil exists within the circumference of God's will and his sovereignty. John's presentation of the role of evil is deft and complex. The evil actions of the wicked are truly evil, representing the authentic choices and decisions of those who pursue wickedness. God is not directly responsible for the evil that occurs, but neither does evil take on an independent status, as if it is unleashed on the world in a way that mystifies and puzzles God, as if even God himself doesn't exercise control over wickedness. God is sovereign over evil, does not himself commit what is evil, and yet permits the evil that takes place. We find confirmation, by the way, of Satan's authority over the world elsewhere in the New Testament. The devil promises, you're all very familiar with this, right? He promises Jesus the kingdoms of the world if Jesus will bow down and worship him. Is that just a lie? You could take it that way, but I don't think so. 3 times the Gospel of John designates Satan, and I think it's the same author here that's disputed in the Gospel of John and Revelation. I take it to be John the Apostle. But 3 times in the Gospel of John, Satan is designated as the ruler of this world. In the first epistle, 1 John 5:19, John says, you're familiar with this verse, the whole world lies under the sway of the evil one. Paul says in Ephesians 2:2, Satan is the god of this world. That's 2 Corinthians 4:4. Ephesians 2:2 says he is the ruler of the power of the air. Well, Revelation specifically adds is that God, in accord with his own mysterious wisdom, has given this authority to the devil. Thus God, not the dragon, is ultimately sovereign. The devil's rule over the world is a derived authority, one that God has granted him. So it's fascinating to see that the dragon gave, right, it was given by God, but now the dragon gave, this is 13:4, a doken. So now you have an active verb. The dragon gave active voice authority to the beast. So God's granting of authority to the beast is invariably passive, adathe. And yet it's clear that God has ultimate sovereignty over Satan. The active verb with reference to the dragon indicates that Satan stands behind the evil that is done more directly, so that the devil is morally responsible for the evil inflicted. God, on the other hand, stands behind evil indirectly and is not morally responsible for evil, even though evil could not exist apart from his will. We could say that God wills evil for a good purpose ultimately, although there are dimensions to what John says that are mysterious. I use that in a theological sense there, particularly since John does not offer an explanation for God's allowing such evil to occur. In other words, I'd argue we can't answer every question here. It is clear in the narrative that the murder of the saints by the beast is a horrendous evil of which God disapproves. And yet by permitting such to happen, he wills its existence. Still, there's comfort in knowing that the dragon and the 2 beasts are not running loose in a universe sundered from God's will. He rules and reigns over all. God's sovereignty and independence are also communicated when he is described as the one who is, who was, and who is to come. That's in 1:4 and 1:8. That's a clear allusion to Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, where God discloses himself to Moses, I am who I am. Of course, there's tremendous debate over what that means. I think at the very least, it indicates the Lord's sufficiency, his independence, and his sovereignty. So in Revelation, the Lord reminds believers that even in the midst of their current circumstances, so I take this as a very practical book. That's what motivates me. He's Almighty God. You know, it's true of your circumstances today. Who knows what you're going through today? He is Almighty God. He has always reigned as the creator and ruler of all history, since he's the one who was. There never was a time when he did not exercise his rule over the world. And the future is also in his hands because he's the one to come. He's the one who will bring history to its appointed consummation. It's interesting, 4:8 changes it, because in 4:8, instead of who is and was and is to come, it's who was and who is to come. Perhaps he shifts who was first to emphasize especially God's sovereignty over the past. And then I think it's very interesting that when you come to 11:17 and 16:5, God is described as the one who is and the one who was, but it doesn't say he's the one to come. Now, why not? Because if you look at 11:15 through 19, and if you look at Revelation 16:5, both of those sections describe a time period where God is wrapping up history, right? 11:15 through 19 is the seventh trumpet, where everything's completed. He doesn't have to say who is to come because the passage is about him coming. So it's actually happening in that passage. And the same, I think, in Revelation 16, which is a bit more difficult, but I think we have the same thing there. It's the very end of history. God's rule over history is also communicated in the declaration, I am the Alpha and the Omega. We see that in 1:8 and 21:6. The latter verse, 21:6, unpacks that by adding, he's the beginning and the end. So that the comprehensiveness of the phrases demonstrate that the Lord reigns over every moment, every circumstance between the beginning and the end. You know, it's not just saying he's the beginning and the end and everything in between is not under God's rule, right? If he's the Alpha and the Omega, he rules over everything. We're not surprised, therefore, to find in 1:8 that the Lord is identified as the Almighty, the Pantocrator. And John uses that term 8 times in the book. So God reigns as the all-powerful one, as the awesome creator, as the sustainer of the universe, as the one who is working out all things for his good purposes. So sometimes I say to my students, Revelation is full of really strange things. Like God is the creator and the sovereign over all, right? That's not so different, is it, than the rest of the New Testament or the Old Testament as well. Revelation, so it's very practical. I think Revelation reminds the suffering church that God is the king of the ages, the ruler over all, and thus evil can't and it won't triumph. Some contemporary Christians de-emphasize God's sovereignty when the topic of suffering arises. They have the laudable motive, and I think it is a laudable motive, and even a right theological instinct in many senses, of separating God from the evil that occurs in the world. John in Revelation, however, without charging God with doing evil, ratchets up the role of God's sovereignty. John doesn't believe the saints would be comforted by teaching them that God stands by helplessly when they suffer. Instead, the Lord reigns and rules over all that takes place in the world, and thus no suffering which strikes believers can take place apart from the will of God. John doesn't attempt to resolve the problem of evil philosophically, although, as we have seen, he uses the passive voice in denoting God's role in evil that takes place, which indicates that God should not be held to be directly accountable for the evil that occurs. Of course, these are deep philosophical issues, but since I'm teaching the Bible, I'm not trying to resolve that philosophically right now. But I want to be just at least grounded in what the text says. Let's talk about God's beautiful holiness. If we return to the throne room vision in chapter 4, the Lord is seated on his throne, and his appearance was like jasper and carnelian stone, 4:3. A rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald surrounded the throne. And here, I quote Ezekiel 1:26 through 28, but because I'm a little bit pressed for time now, because I'd spent too much time telling you my testimony probably, I'm going to skip reading those verses. I trust you know them, of the appearance of the Lord in Ezekiel 1, which is, of course, you all know Revelation draws so much on the Old Testament. It's absolutely vital to know the Old Testament to understand Revelation. Really, but you can't do it without knowing the Old Testament. Commentators have attempted to find a one-to-one correspondence between the descriptions in Revelation and the attributes of God. The danger in such an approach is arbitrariness, a lack of clear evidence, trying to match every stone with a particular attribute. It's for these specific identifications, it's not always clear. I would argue John didn't expect us to be so precise in untangling the portrait given. He intends the readers to be impacted by the general impact of the vision. He uses imagery like Ezekiel to describe the indescribable, so that the readers would be struck by the awesome beauty of the Lord. The stones in the rainbow at least emblazon on the reader's heart the splendor and the loveliness of God himself. Or another way of putting it is John doesn't focus on describing God himself, but gives an indirect vision of him. Here I think Richard Bauckham is helpful. He says the unknowable transcendence of God is protected by focusing instead on the throne itself and what goes around it. We see there in chapter 4, you see those 24 elders and the 4 living beings, which we won't linger to talk about here. But it's a fascinating passage, isn't it? Because there's a massive thunderstorm happening in the throne room. It's just, and the presence of God, chapter 4, verse 5, is absolutely terrifying. I think that's the point of the vision. It reminds us of Mount Sinai, right, where there's thunder and lightning and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet sound. So all the people in the camp shuddered. So I think it alludes to that. And so I'm skipping down a bit, but the living beings are exclaiming, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God the Almighty." And of course, there we're drawn back to Isaiah 6:3, where the seraphim exclaim the same. So God's holiness designates his distinctiveness, showing he's separate from all creation, that he's not to be trifled with as the ruler of all the earth. And it connects with chapter 4. He is worthy, but in chapter, it connects with chapter 5. In chapter 5, no one is worthy to open the scroll. So the Lord's holiness consists in his infinite and matchless moral purity. Where we think of Hebrews, which is drawing on the Old Testament, right? Our God is a consuming fire. So I think that's the point. The point of the throne room vision, right, is God is awesomely holy. And there's a sense, there's a right sense, which I think our culture has lost to a great extent, not totally. Even evangelical culture, there's a right sense to say that God is terrifying. So when we come to the conclusion of Revelation 4, with the worship of the 4 living beings and the 24 elders, it accords with God's greatness, that he's incomparable. The elders fall before the God who sits on the throne and worship him. They acclaim him as worthy to receive all glory and honor and power. He's worshipped because he's the creator and the sovereign of the universe, because it is by his will that all things have come into being. And we have other songs of praise, right, don't we, in Revelation, and I was quoting some of those, but again, because of time, maybe I'm rushing ahead too much, but I want to leave plenty of time for questions and comments. I'm not gonna focus on those, but I'm going to jump ahead to what the angel says in 19:10 and 22:9, and the angel says there, worship God. Worship God. I think that's another way of summarizing what is Revelation telling us about God. It's telling us that he is to be worshipped. again, Bauckham, and Baukham's book on Revelation, I mean, he has two, but his little theology of the book of Revelation is fantastic. It is worth noticing how far from anthropocentric is this vision of worship. Humanity is radically displaced from the center of things where human beings naturally tend to place themselves. So the focus is on God himself and his glory and his holiness. Revelation takes us back to the first commandment in Exodus 20, verse 3, which summons all human beings everywhere to put God first in their lives, to give him all their worship, praise, and adoration. So the suffering church, what does it need? It needs a fresh vision of God as the sovereign creator, as the one who is awesomely beautiful and terrifying in the good sense of that word, in his holiness. And believers are to be filled with praise and thanks as they give all glory, honor, and worship to him, while at the same time resisting the blandishments of the beast and the false prophets. So that, that's very, I said that kind of humorously before, but that's very important to me. It's what I preach through Revelation in our church. And what I tried to emphasize is I said, look, we even have in this church and surely in this room different views of Revelation. But the mainstream teachings of Revelation are found in the rest of Scripture. But here we have it in apocalyptic dress, and which appeals to our imaginations and closes the canon in a fitting way. But it's not. We ought not to view Revelation as a distinctive message that's somehow separable from the rest of the canon. Even the use of the Old Testament over and over in the book would speak against such a view. And because I think in evangelical circles, either Revelation is used as kind of often, maybe less today, as a kind of a prophecy chart. Maybe that's kind of falling away. Or people just don't do anything with it, though. They're afraid. They're afraid to preach and teach it because they feel like, well, I can't answer all the questions. But my take on it is we don't have to answer all the questions. None of us can know the answers to all the questions anyway. So, that's what this little book for me is about. Here's the mainstream teaching. Any pastor, any teacher who gives themselves to the book can grasp and understand this mainstream message. Having said that, of course, there are differences of opinions, and maybe that's going to come out a little bit now, because I'm going to talk about God's judgment, and then inevitably you have to talk about the seals and the trumpets and the bowls. And people differ on details, obviously. So the holiness of God is absolute goodness, means he can't tolerate evil, and thus one of the major themes of Revelation is the judgment of evil. We should note at the outset, I think this is important hermeneutically, the words of judgment are not written to unbelievers. Unbelievers aren't reading this book. They're written for the believers, which I think is helpful. They're not vengeful words hurled at unbelievers. This is what's going to happen to you, right? They remind suffering believers that God is just, that everything will be set right in the end, and that evil will not triumph. They have a very pastoral function. I think they're true. I think they're true about what will happen to unbelievers. But what's their function? So their function is to encourage believers to persevere in faith and in goodness. So here I want to say something a little bit about the seal, the trumpets, and the bowls. The seals, right, are 6:1 through 8:5 with an interlude. The trumpets 8:1 through 11:19 with an interlude, in the bowls in chapter 16. They come in a series of 3 sevens. The number 7 indicates the completeness of the judgments, indicating that the judgments vindicate God's righteousness. So some maintain that these judgments refer to the events prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, a typical kind of a preterist view. Dispensationalists argue that they refer to judgments which occur in the last 7 years in history, or the last 3.5, depending on how they parse it. Others think that the seals, trumpets, and bowls represent the judgments and encompass all history from the ascension of Christ to his second coming. So, and that's where I am. So I would put myself in that last category. I would just tweak this view a little bit and argue that the seals and trumpets represent judgments that occur throughout history But the bowl judgments that are unleashed in chapter 16 are so comprehensive that it's hard to imagine how they can describe something that takes place throughout history. So I'll say a little bit more about this. So let's start. There's kind of a progressive parallelism, as others have said, right, in these judgments. So I'm not going to go over every one. That would take a lot of time. But I'm just going to mention right quickly, just for sake of review, right? The seal judgments, the white horse. You have the victory, you have the red horse and war, the black horse and famine, the pale horse and rampant death, the fifth seal, the souls of the martyrs, the death of the martyrs, and then the sixth seal, the final earthquake, and then the seventh seal opens up the seven trumpets. Now I'm just going to jump down into a couple of them and say a couple of words. I am... So the seals, in my view, the seals describe the judgments occurring from the resurrection to the second coming. And I think, again, this itself is very controversial, but I think they match Jesus' eschatological discourse in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. At least that's how I take them. So the seal judgments describe what's happening all through history. And it's not so hard to understand, right? What is history marked by? Well, it's marked by wars, by famines, by death, Christians being put to death. But I return to the first one, and I'm probably wrong on this, but I'm still unrepentant. Hardly anybody agrees with me on this. I have a friend who said, I really like your commentary on Revelation, but here you're wrong. But here I go. Peter Gentry does agree with me, and that gives me some comfort. So, because he's almost infallible. Well, no, maybe not. But the white horse, I take, of the first seal, I take to be Christ. So, some people think it's the Antichrist, right? Some people think it's referring to war. But the other time the white horse occurs in Revelation in chapter 19 is Jesus himself. So I take this to be one characteristic of the age that we're in is the progress of the gospel in the world through Jesus Christ. So it's also marked, right, by wars and by famines and by Christians being put to death and so forth and so on. But that fits with Matthew 24:14. Remember, I see an analog in the eschatological discourse. The good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So, at least in my view, it even fits 2,000 years later, because we can even retrospectively say, yes, since the ascension of Christ, life is marked by what? The proclamation of the gospel, by wars, by famines, by the persecution of Christians, and this is all happening together. This is what was predicted. These things, in and of themselves, aren't a sign that the end has come. So I say we see in these first four seals that so-called ordinary events, from the preaching of the gospel to wars, famines, and plagues, represent God's work in the world, and particularly, but not exclusively, his judgment on human sin. There, I think it's quite similar to Romans 1:18 through 32, in that the troubles of the world signify God's judgment. What happens in the world is not a result of fate or chance, but John unveils to the reader God's perspective on such occurrences. Now, let me add something. We should not overread what is being said here, as if John is drawing a one-to-one correspondence between difficulties in life and human evil. John recognizes, doesn't he, that believers may suffer economic deprivation as well, since they are the object of persecution and discrimination. So I think John paints a big picture, and we could fall into danger if we try to be too specific in saying, oh, these people are being judged, that's because they've sinned. I don't think that's John's point. I think John's point is the events that are happening in the world are not merely sound and fury, signifying nothing. These judgments in history are a prelude to the final judgment. The fifth seal, that's very important to me, it zeroes in on the death and prayers of the martyrs, those who were slaughtered and who dwell under the altar because of their devotion to God's word. And they're asking, as picking up on the Old Testament, they're asking, how long? How long, O Lord? And they're told to rest and to wait, because the day of judgment is coming, but there are others who will be put to death just as they have been put to death. And Jesus said, didn't he, in the eschatological discourse, then they will hand you over to be persecuted, and they will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. So, I just pause to say, we have brothers and sisters today being put to death somewhere, right? We have, so we don't see them, we probably don't know them. Maybe, I always pause to say this, maybe that would happen to some of us in this room. Probably not with our social location, but who knows where you'll end up, right? What circumstances you'll find yourself in. So it's, it's a very, it's a reality to others, and it's a good reminder for a pastoral word. It's a good reminder for us to remember to pray for our brothers and sisters who are suffering. It's easy for us, it's easy for me, at least, to forget what's happening to them. Ultimately, justice will be done, though, is what this seal tells us. The sixth seal is very controversial. I think the sixth seal, again, is the final judgment. I think that brings us to the end of history. And so I argue, along with many others, but many others disagree, right? I argue that Revelation is recursive, and we have recapitulation going on, so that John brings us to the end of the book repeatedly. Now, I don't think I'll ever write on this, but I think it's sort of interesting, because I think John the Apostle wrote this, and I think he wrote 1 John, and it's so interesting how 1 John is like that in an epistolary form, isn't it? It just kind of circles around to the same themes over and over again, and how Revelation does that in an apocalyptic form. Of course, they're very different kinds of writings, but that's always struck me. The seventh seal, I'd argue, people say, how can the sixth seal be the end? There's a seventh seal. But I would argue that the seventh seal is a literary device, and it just introduces us to the seven trumpets, and I'm arguing the seven trumpets are the same period of time from another perspective. Well, why do I think the sixth seal is the end? Just to give you a few arguments. First, the word earthquake in every instance in the book signifies the end of history. And Bauckham argues this in an important article in 1977. We see this in chapter 8, verse 5, chapter 11, verse 13, chapter 11, verse 19, and chapter 16, verse 18. Second, the imagery here picks up on the day of the Lord imagery, which is a common feature in the Old Testament prophets. But here we have the climactic and final day of the Lord. Third, obviously we have apocalyptic language here, but the apocalyptic language symbolizes the end. The entire created world is falling apart as the sun becomes black and the moon turns to blood. I think that's symbolic language. But I think it's designating what? It's the end. The stars in the heavens are hurled from heaven to earth. This is the days of the Lord in the Old Testament are now coming to the final day of the Lord. That's the end. The created order is unraveling. 6:13. The sky is rolled up like a scroll. Isaiah 34:4. John is telling us life on the earth is over. The world won't continue forever as it now is. In 6:14, the mountains and the islands are being displaced. And we read in 1620, so 1620 is clearly the end, right? The end of the bowls. That you see in 1620 that every island fled and the mountains disappeared. So it's very interesting for the recapitulation, right? The same thing's happening. Everything's being displaced in the world. And then we see it again in chapter 20, verse 11. Again, you have this fleeing of islands and the vanishing of mountains. So at three crucial places, he recapitulates the end by just using the same language. This is the end of history. So John wants us to read it in one way. I would argue John wants us to read this rather simply, because we see, here's the end again, and again, and again. So he really wants to impress upon the readers what's happening. Fourth, that the end is at hand is evident from the response of unbelievers. They're terrified because the judgment is coming, 6:15 through 17. They're begging to be spared. It's the last judgment from the God who sits on the throne and the Lamb's wrath. John tells us the great day of their wrath has come. you know, Carl Truman came to our chapel a few years ago, and one thing he said struck me, because he said, you know, many people in our culture today, when you talk about the gospel, they don't seem very interested. They can put it off. But he said, remember, everybody's going to die. And if they die slowly, they'll begin to think of the future, right? And I think of that when I read this passage. Because when you begin to die, if you die somewhat slowly and you have a time to think, at least there's an opportunity there. Not that we don't take opportunities now, but as Samuel Johnson said, death wonderfully concentrates the mind, right? So so I move from the seal judgments to the trumpet judgments. The trumpet judgments, for me, you know, I mentioned this yesterday, where Bauckham said you have these images and visions in Revelation without as much explanation of what the visions meant. And the trumpet judgments are one place where I'd love a little more explanation. You know, you have these signs and symbols, but then there's not a lot of interpretation given to the readers. And at least for me as an interpreter, I find this to be a difficult part to interpret. I've been reading in the history of interpretation, and one of the things I guess that's somewhat comforting is people have struggled with this all through history. Some really wild interpretations have been suggested, but we can understand why, because we're trying to figure this out. I'm not going to, you know, I just look at the time even. I'm not going to run through all these. You know, the first four remind us of the Exodus plagues, right? That's often been pointed out. So the first one, 1/3 of the earth, you have hail, fire, and blood. Second trumpet, 1/3 of the sea, a burning mountain is thrown into the sea, is blighted. The third trumpet, 1/3 of the river and the springs are blighted. A burning star falls on the rivers. Then 1/3 of the light of the skies for the fourth trumpet. So, you know, very resonant of those Exodus plagues. I take it the 1/3 means, so I take these, you make up your own mind, you will anyway, right? I take it that the 1/3 indicates it's not a precise calculation, but the whole world is not vitiated. From the first to the second coming, the world isn't all it should be or could be. And those are the judgments of God. And they're actually calling, you know, the difficulties in the world, the judgments coming on the world, they're calling on people to repent. That's the purpose. Well, just because this interests me, and I want to say something about the fifth trumpet. Because here you have a star falling from heaven to earth. It opens up the shaft of the abyss. The smoke swirls up out of the open shaft. And then these locusts that are like scorpions flood the earth. So that's a very fascinating story. And then these locusts, what does he say? They sting like scorpions, right? And people experience unbelievable torment for 5 months. I mean, how do we interpret that? That's a very difficult thing. But I think we'd all agree, well, these are not literal locusts, right? I mean, he tells us these locusts, I can't find it in my notes, but I know it's there. They don't eat grass, plants, or trees. These aren't. They're like no locusts you've ever seen. Well, John's clearly telling us they're not really locusts. And I agree. I think most interpreters would say that they're demons coming out of the abyss. I mean, they're coming out of that abyss, so some kind of demonic presence. So what does it mean, though? You know, it's hard to be sure, but I think what John is saying is I think he reflects on the judgment of unbelievers throughout history, and I don't think the sting is a literal sting for 5 months and some people interpret it that way, and if you interpret it that way, I want you to know, just because there have been so many fights over this, I respect any different view on this. I mean, it's tough, isn't it? But I think John is saying life is kind of a living death for people. In other words, unbelievers find life so miserable and painful that they long to die and to end it all and to commit suicide. and yet they don't want to take that final step and to terminate their lives either. And so their lives are a kind of living death. Now, you might think, wait a minute. We must beware of flat-footed interpretations. Clearly, some unbelievers enjoy wonderful lives and are fulfilled in many respects. I don't think John is trying to describe the interior life of every individual. I don't think that's what's going on. Still, many people live lives, as people say, of quiet desperation. They're reluctant to share their fears and their miseries with others. Those who don't know God experience torment and grief that is not accessible to ordinary human imagination. And we don't know what's going on with people. You know, even people that are Christians, that are close friends, sometimes we're very surprised to find out what they're really thinking. So I don't think this is so far from being from the truth of what's going on. Then the sixth trumpet is the angels being released at the Euphrates. You know, the Euphrates is the border of the Promised Land and also the border for the Parthians. So again, I think it stands for demonic powers. And the seventh trumpet is clearly the end. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of the Lord and of his Christ. So that's clearly the end of all history. So I'm almost done here because I want to open it up. Let me say a couple of things about the bowl judgments. God's holiness is the framework for interpreting the bowl judgments. That theme is captured in 14:7. Where the people are instructed to fear God, give him glory, and worship him as creator. And I'm arguing the bowl judgments, which I'm not going to review, are so comprehensive that they're occurring near the end or at the end of history. I mean, because the whole sea turns to blood, right? All the rivers and springs turn to blood. I mean, whatever those symbolize, I think he's saying life on earth is ending, because it's absolutely comprehensive. So and I've been very influenced by Greg Beale, but there I differ from Greg because he still sees it as happening all through history, and that's hard for me to see in these judgments. Although I did talk to Greg about this, and he said, yeah, maybe you're right. So it's we all agree on Revelation. Not everything is easy to work out. The ferocity of the judgments leads to a question. Are these judgments disproportionate? And do they represent injustice on God's part? Is it fair and right for the Lord to unleash such suffering upon the world, specifically upon unbelievers? Well, I'm reminded of something I skipped. Remember, over and over we're told that the purpose of these judgments is to bring people to repentance. So that's very important to see. But I'm not emphasizing that in particular right here because I'm in chapter 16. John asked the same question, didn't he? In 16:5-7, because he reiterates twice there that yes, God's judgments are just. So understanding that question was asked in the past by John's readers is important because we tend to think that we're more sensitive to evil and that we have a higher sense of justice than those who preceded us. But in the midst of the judgments, John pauses to answer the question about God's justice. He emphasized God's righteousness and judgment, indicating that his judgments are just since the world has spilled the blood of the saints. As a consequence, unbelievers are now drinking blood. We have a clear example here of retributive justice, where the punishment fits the crime. Thus, we are told that unbelievers deserve 16, I guess I don't have the verse here, but it's in 16:5-7. Axioi, they deserve their punishments. Their punishments are fitting that they receive. And John zeroes in on the fact that they did not repent when these judgments arrived, which is the same theme which concludes the trumpet judgments. God's judgments are warranted and deserved, and they should soften hearts. But instead, those who've sided with the beast are infuriated and blaspheme his name even more. Their response accords with the proverb, Proverbs 19:3. A person's own foolishness leads him astray, yet his heart rages against the Lord. Now I have something here on the judgment of Babylon, and I'm going to skip all that. I have a section on the images of the final judgment. No, I'm just going to read the last paragraph, and then we can talk about things because I don't have time to get into the other. The emphasis on judgment and revelation may strike us as a theme which is alien to the rest of the New Testament, where salvation and God's love seem more prominent. Some might dismiss the book as a regression to a God of wrath, which was allegedly left behind in the New Testament witness. Still, Revelation affirms that a Marcionite reading of the Old Testament neglects both the Old Testament and the revelation of the true God in the New Testament. Judgment and justice reflect God's holiness, which is fundamental to God's character. Elevating God's love over his holiness distorts the nature of love, since love and holiness are not opposed to one another, but both play an integral part in God's character. Furthermore, a right reading of the rest of the New Testament indicates that God's justice is not left behind. The pastoral dimension in the emphasis on justice must not be neglected. The theme may seem alien when the church prospers and is celebrated in society, but when the church faces discrimination, as it did in this book, right? Hatred, persecution, and martyrdom, when believers see agonizing suffering in the real world, which are not just words on a page, they wonder, is faithfulness to Christ worth it? They question whether giving oneself to evil has consequences, whether there is finally justice and righteousness in the world. If evil is perpetrated and there's no justice, evil is evacuated as a moral category. God's justice and judgment underscores that decisions in life are significant, and there is such a thing as good and evil, and that the world isn't the product of a blind faith. We are reminded in the emphasis on judgment that salvation is from the Lord, for all deserve to be judged. The salvation of any, that includes us, is due to God's grace and to his redeeming work. God's eschatological salvation, which I'll talk about more tomorrow, is connected to the judgment of the wicked. For ultimate deliverance and rescue is realized when the wicked are judged, when evil is totally removed from the scene and banished to the lake of fire. Thank you.